You're listening to Bob Harden, streaming live online at bobharden.com.
Thanks so much for joining us here on the show. It's brought to you in part by the good folks at Johnson's Air Conditioning, Naples' longest established air conditioning company, as well as Naples Illustrated, bringing you infinite luxury lifestyles. Visit the website, naplesillustrated.com. Coming up, we're going to visit with Bill Barnett, Naples City Councilman. Right now we have with us Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Dr. Jasser is an author of The Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim's Patriot's Fight to Save His Faith by Simon & Schuster. Terrific read, and I strongly encourage you to read his book, as well as he's the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Dr. Jasser, thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be with you, Bob. Thanks for having me back.
Always a pleasure, Doctor. So we've had a lot of changes and a lot going on with regard to ISIS coming out of Syria, seemingly. And now the atrocities, it's like Nazis on steroid, quite frankly, when you take a look at what's happening in Iraq as well as in Syria.
It really is, and it's sort of fascinating to see the approach of the president to policies in the region in which he's talking about now getting a coalition. And not only did we do airstrikes in northern Iraq, they are appropriately considering airstrikes in Syria. I mean, I look at it like treating a cancer. It would be malpractice to simply take out a metastases here and there without getting to the primary cancer, which is, in this case, in Syria. And it's interesting how he's not even talking about getting congressional approval and all these things in which he was passive-aggressively talking about doing what needed to be done last August after Assad used chemical weapons. And now he seems to be just moving forward as he should to get rid of ISIS. And it's sad that we continue this whack-a-mole approach to foreign policy and national security where groups like, as we saw in 9/11, Al-Qaeda did not come out of thin air. Al-Qaeda came out of a country like Saudi Arabia, which has petrodollars that fuel to the billions, ideologies that radicalize its people, radicalize Muslims around the world, and we never address the primary problem. So we continue to see them sprout all over, and after the Arab awakening, we've seen a recurrence, a resurgence into that vacuum of radical Islamist groups. And now with ISIS, we are treating this as a whack-a-mole issue and not treating the primary problem, which was Assad, that exerted a genocide on the majority of Sunnis in Syria that ultimately took a country that really had negligible amounts of Al-Qaeda in 2011, and then now since then has become the world's greatest magnet for jihadists.
Right. And it creates a real conundrum because, in a sense, by taking out ISIS, doesn't, in a sense, the president side with Assad and perhaps even with the Iranians?
Well, it seems that way since we apparently have a common enemy. But I would ask any analyst, any American, to look at the history in the past year, look at the bombing patterns in Syria. Syria has the capability to, with jets and tanks and artillery from Russia and from Iran, with tens of thousands of soldiers from Iran and money, to have gotten rid of ISIS a long time ago. But its bombing patterns are to the moderate neighborhoods in Aleppo, to the moderate factions of the Free Syria Army, and it's used the ISIS existence to give the Free Syria Army two fronts in which to deal with, and also legitimize a draconian military control of its country, which is very much out of the Arab dictator's playbook of what happens in almost every country, and Assad just has put that on steroids. And, ultimately, if Assad genuinely wanted to get rid of ISIS, he could have done it a long time ago. So we will, by getting rid of it. And that's why Assad's making tons of statements, his foreign minister and others the past week, prohibiting America from doing anything inside Syria because it would violate sovereignty and, change his plans. Because once ISIS is gone, the Free Syria Army can focus on him. Now, we did say that, while we're getting ISIS, why don't we also take out a few runways and take out some of Assad's capabilities, which we should have done back in 2013.
Right. Yeah. Well, in a sense, I mean, right now, I listened to the president's comments, and he, to his credit, he detested what had happened with regard to the beheading of this individual and, his comments, but he still refused to refer to this as Islamic Jihad. And, again, if we don't talk about who the enemy is, how are we going to possibly defeat it?
And what better example do we want of what these guys are about than their name, the Islamic State? He has to, but yet we call them ISIS, and we let their acronym speak for them, so that we pretend it has nothing to do with Islamist ideology. And ultimately, it's interesting. Some of the so-called moderate imams who are pretty radical, like Qardawi, who is one of the spiritual guides, influencers of the Brotherhood globally, when asked and confronted recently about the Islamic State concept and ISIS, he ignored the question and wouldn't respond, because these guys, the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, are stuck. They realize that this is like the guys who hand out drugs, and they're demonstrating that one of the worst drug addicts in the world is producing militant ideology, and they don't want to take ownership that they're the gateway to that through the Islamist ideology. And President Obama realizes that if he starts talking about Islamism and the ideological source of the jihadists, he'll go down a pathway he just doesn't want to do. So he'd rather stay, with the 10-foot pole approach to avoid it. And unfortunately, it will continue the cycle of whack-a-mole approach to radicalism and not confront the ideology. And, we see this with radicalization. There are more Brits serving with ISIS than there are Brits in the British services as far as Muslims.
Wow.
And same thing in America now. We've got, they say recently, 250 to 300 Americans serving with the armed forces, with the ISIS services. And it is sad to see that nobody's addressing what the magnetism is for that ideology for Americans, and why aren't they wanting to be on this side of the war, serving with America?
It's so true. I mean, apparently we've seen our second American killed now in this battle as a radical Muslim. Now, you narrated, I thought, a terrific piece. I don't know if it's still available. It's called The Third Jihad. It's a documentary about how radical Islam is spreading in America. Is that still available?
Yep. It's available on Netflix. It's available online at thethirdjihad.com. And, it is an evergreen study of why and how ideologies spread from the Saudis, spread from the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, that all these Islamist ideologies, how they radicalize, how they are a threat to the West. And it's not just that, anyone's concerned about 2% of the population in France or 1% in America taking over the country, but the threat as far as, lack of assimilation, of trying to influence American foreign policy to make us more isolationist and allow the Islamists to take over the Middle East, and all these other aspects that influence what's happening. And sure enough, that film documentary we put together in 2008 with Clarion Project has still proven to be extraordinarily true to what's been happening even since the Arab Awakening in 2011.
Well, and I'll say this as well. When I saw the film, The Third Jihad, it was shocking, because what you make the case for what's happening in America, right here in America, in our prisons and in a variety of communities where Islamic Jihad is getting a stronghold.
Yeah, and, the film goes through the threat of Iran. It goes through the threat of prisons here in America, and how, and many, if you look at these ISIS recruits, many of them are converts who are looking for redemption, looking for the keys to heaven that ISIS gives them, that the more militant you can be, the more you will correct the wrongs in your life. And this rapper from Britain, who was believed to be the guy who beheaded Mr. Foley in that barbaric fashion, clearly was drawn by that lure. And unless we as Muslims can begin to tease out and reform the concepts that are being pushed by ISIS and have a counter ideology, counter Islamist movement, we're not going to get anywhere as far as fighting the threat.
The American Islamic Forum for Democracy, Doctor, it's all about separation of mosque and state, is it not?
Absolutely. The Islamic State, at its worst form, this is what you see form northern Iraq and Syria. But Islamic State of Saudi Arabia, of Egypt, those are all countries that believe that there's no separation of mosque and state. The Quran should be the constitution. Clerics should be the lawmakers and law writers. And ultimately, the regular lay Muslim has no role to do in law. And this is why the West's Enlightenment, based in reason, and ultimately the American Revolution against theocracy. It worked for Christianity, and there's no reason it can't work for Islam, with leaders and reformists and Americans in policy taking the side of anti-Islamists who want to separate mosque and state. And this isn't a pipe dream. We had 10 million Muslims go to the streets against the Brotherhood in Egypt that didn't want theocracy. They're there. They just haven't been organized and haven't had a strategy in the West to engage them.
So, again, I'm going to encourage our listeners to go to aifdemocracy.org, aifdemocracy.org. Also, get a copy of The Battle for the Soul of Islam, An American Muslim's Patriot's Fight to Save His Faith. Again, it's by Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. It is a terrific read, and I encourage you to, it first of all, gives you insight into the whole Islamic Jihad movement, but second of all, I found it, Doctor, I learned so much about your faith as a result of reading the book and how you practice it. It was I just credit you for being so transparent.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's the battle, is that we need Muslims that love their faith to talk about reform as a passion, as a love, rather than as from outside. And you can't reform anything from the outside.
Doctor, a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Anytime. Thanks, Bob.
My pleasure.